I sat alone in my cabin. The only company, the crackling fire and the distant howl of the wind through the towering pines of the Pacific Northwest. The place was a reflection of me. Rugged, worn, and full of scars. The walls were lined with hunting trophies, relics from a life spent chasing shadows and nightmares. Tonight was no different. But there was a heaviness in the air that I couldn't shake. The file on the table in front of me seemed to pulsate with an unseen energy, daring me to open it. I took a long drag from my cigarette, the smoke curling upwards in lazy tendrils, and finally decided to dive in. The leather-bound folder was thick, stuffed with reports, photographs, and handwritten notes. The label on the cover read simply, "The Wraith." Flipping it open, I was greeted by the first of many grisly photos. Cold, desiccated bodies found in an abandoned psychiatric hospital. Victims with their eyes wide open, mouths frozen in silent screams. The words on the page blurred as my mind began to race, the old hunter instincts kicking in. The Wraith. A creature of shadows and whispers, a predator that blended seamlessly into the darkness, moving silently through the night. It was said to be a dense, swirling mass of smoky tendrils, taking on a vaguely humanoid form when it decided to show itself. No face, no eyes, just a featureless head and elongated limbs. The kind of thing that makes your blood run cold and your heart pound like a war drum. I read through the characteristics, committing each detail to memory. The Wraith moved silently, blending with shadows to become nearly invisible. It manipulated the whispers it emitted, playing on the deepest fears and secrets of its victims, breaking them down mentally before moving in for the kill. Its touch was like ice, causing severe hypothermia with prolonged contact, and when it chose to kill, it enveloped its prey in those smoky tendrils, draining their life force until nothing but a cold, desiccated husk remained. Son of a bitch, I muttered under my breath, taking another drag. This wasn't going to be an easy hunt, but then they never were. The file detailed its weaknesses too. Intense light could force it to dissipate temporarily, and it struggled to interact with well-lit objects or those made of reflective materials, mirrors and polished metals. I'd have to remember that. Next came the location, an abandoned psychiatric hospital on the outskirts of a small town. The place was a crumbling relic, filled with dark, shadowy corners perfect for the Wraith to hide. The hospital had a tragic history, rumors of unethical experiments and numerous patient deaths. It was a breeding ground for the kind of darkness that births monsters. The most recent victims were a group of urban explorers, their bodies found huddled together in a dark basement room. Their faces haunted me even from the photos. Young, curious, and stupid enough to wander into places they shouldn't have. They'd paid the ultimate price. I closed the file, setting it down with a deliberate thud. My mind was already working on a plan. I'd need to pack the right gear, high-powered flashlights, mirrors, and maybe some other surprises. The Wraith might be a creature of shadows, but I'd faced worse. Much worse. I stood up, the old floorboards creaking beneath my weight. The fire cast my shadow long and dark against the wooden walls, a fitting backdrop for the task ahead. I took one last look around my cabin, this sanctuary that had seen so many battles and so much bloodshed. This was just another chapter in a long, bloody book. I grabbed my gear, checking each piece meticulously. My battered leather jacket, sturdy boots, and a belt laden with weapons and tools. Everything had its place. Everything had its purpose. The weight of it all was a familiar comfort as I stepped out into the night, the cold air biting at my skin. Time to dance with the devil, I whispered to myself, my breath visible in the chilly air. I locked the door behind me, the cabin's lights flickering as if to bid me farewell. The drive to the hospital was long and silent, the road winding through dark forests and past sleeping towns. The Wraith was out there, waiting, and I intended to meet it head-on. This was what I did. This was who I was, Lucas Moore, monster hunter. And tonight, I was going to hunt a Wraith. As I approached the decrepit silhouette of the hospital, my grip tightened on the steering wheel. The battle hadn't even started yet, but I could already feel the whispers creeping into my mind, trying to unsettle me. Not tonight, I thought. Not fucking tonight. I killed the engine and stepped out, the cold air wrapping around me like a shroud. The hospital loomed ahead, dark and silent, a monument to the madness it once housed. With a final glance at the moonlit sky, I took a deep breath and walked toward the entrance, ready to face the horrors that awaited within. The air was thick with decay, and the shadows seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy. This was the Wraith's domain. As I approached the entrance, I took a moment to survey the area. The place was a goddamn fortress of darkness, perfect for a predator that thrived in shadows. The front doors were long gone, replaced by a yawning black maw that led into the depths of the hospital. I pulled out my flashlight and clicked it on, the beam cutting through the darkness like a knife. My other hand rested on the hilt of my combat knife, ready for whatever might come at me. The air inside was stale and cold, carrying the faint, sickly sweet scent of rot. My footsteps echoed through the empty halls, the sound a stark contrast to the oppressive silence. I moved slowly, methodically, scanning every inch of my surroundings for any sign of the Wraith. The whispers started almost immediately, soft at first, like a distant murmur, but growing louder with each step I took. They seemed to come from all directions, echoing off the peeling walls and broken tiles. I clenched my jaw and kept moving. I'd been through this before, monsters trying to get into my head, playing on my fears and doubts. But this wasn't my first rodeo. I was here to hunt, and nothing was going to stop me. The hospital was a labyrinth of corridors and rooms, each one more decrepit than the last. Broken equipment, abandoned gurneys, and scattered medical records littered the floors. I passed by old patient rooms, their doors hanging off rusted hinges, and operating theaters with rusted surgical tools still lying on tables. As I ventured deeper, the temperature dropped noticeably. My breath began to fog up, and the whispers grew louder, more insistent. I knew I was getting close. The Wraith was near. I reached a large, open area that had once been the main hall. It was perfect for what I had in mind. I set down my bag and began setting up my trap. Mirrors and high-powered flashlights, arranged strategically to create a web of light. The Wraith wouldn't know what hit it. As I worked, the whispers grew into a cacophony of voices, each one dripping with malice and despair. They clawed at my sanity, trying to break me down. I pushed them aside, focusing on the task at hand. I wasn't here to play games. I was here to kill. Once everything was in place, I took a step back and admired my handiwork. It wasn't perfect, but it would have to do. I moved to the center of the room and stood my ground, waiting for the Wraith to make its move. The whispers stopped abruptly, leaving an eerie silence in their wake. The sudden absence of sound was almost deafening. I scanned the shadows, my heart pounding in my chest. Then, I saw it. The Wraith emerged from the darkness like a living nightmare. A swirling mass of smoky tendrils, coalescing into a vaguely humanoid shape. It moved silently, gliding across the floor towards me, its featureless head tilted slightly, as if studying me. "Come on, you bastard," I muttered, gripping my knife tighter. "Let's finish this." The Wraith lunged at me, its tendrils reaching out with a cold, deadly intent. I dodged to the side, swinging my flashlight around to hit it with a beam of intense light. The creature recoiled, its form flickering and dissipating. I retreated to a safer part of the hospital, the adrenaline from the encounter still coursing through my veins. The Wraith was a tricky bastard, but I had a plan. I found an old office, its door barely hanging on by a hinge, and set up a temporary base. The whispers were gone for now, but I knew they would return. I needed to work fast. I spread out the blueprints of the hospital on a dusty desk, tracing the layout with my finger. The main hall where I'd set up my trap was large, open, and had the right amount of natural light seeping in through the broken windows. It was the perfect battleground. I just had to lure the Wraith there and keep it in the light long enough to finish the job. The mirrors and flashlights I'd set up earlier had worked, but they weren't enough. I needed more light, something intense and sustained. My eyes scanned the blueprints, searching for anything that could help. Then I saw it. A storage room marked electrical. If the old generators were still there and functional, I could rig something up. I left the office and made my way through the hospital, moving swiftly and silently. The air was cold and still, the silence almost oppressive. Every creak of the floorboards, every distant drip of water echoed through the empty halls. But I kept my focus. The storage room was on the other side of the building, down in the basement. The stairs groaned under my weight as I descended into the bowels of the hospital. The air grew colder, the darkness thicker. My flashlight cut through the black, revealing rusted pipes and crumbling walls. The whispers started again, faint and insidious, but I pushed them aside. I couldn't afford distractions. I found the storage room at the end of a long, narrow corridor. The door was locked, but a few hard kicks took care of that. Inside, the room was a chaotic mess of old equipment and forgotten supplies. I rummaged through the debris, my flashlight's beam dancing across dusty shelves and broken crates. Then I found it. An old generator, covered in dust but seemingly intact. I cleared a space around it and started inspecting the machine. The fuel tank was empty, but a quick search yielded a couple of old gas cans. I filled the tank and prayed the generator would still work. With a deep breath, I pulled the starter cord. The engine sputtered, coughed, and then roared to life, filling the room with a mechanical growl. I hooked up a series of industrial floodlights I'd found stashed in the room. These weren't your average flashlights. These were meant to illuminate entire work sites. I set up the lights in the main hall, positioning them to cover every corner. When I was done, the place looked like a goddamn fortress of light. If the Wraith wanted a fight, it was going to get one. With everything in place, I baited the trap. I set a couple of mirrors to reflect and amplify the light, and then I waited. The whispers grew louder, more aggressive, filling the hall with their eerie cacophony. The temperature dropped, and the shadows seemed to thicken, but I stood my ground. The Wraith emerged from the darkness, more menacing than ever. Its form was more defined now, the tendrils thicker, the humanoid shape more pronounced. It moved towards me, the whispers like nails on a chalkboard, but I didn't flinch. I held my ground, my hand on the switch for the floodlights. As the Wraith closed in, I flipped the switch. The hall exploded in light, blinding and intense. The Wraith recoiled, its form flickering and writhing under the assault. I stepped forward, using the mirrors to direct the light, trapping the creature in a web of brilliance. The Wraith's whispers turned into a furious roar, the sound reverberating through the hall. It lashed out, its tendrils reaching for me, but I was ready. I used the mirrors to keep it at bay, the light burning away the shadows. The creature's form began to dissolve, the smoky tendrils turning to wisps of nothingness. But the Wraith wasn't going down without a fight. It surged forward, enveloping me in its icy grip. The cold was unbearable, like being plunged into a frozen lake. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment, the whispers drowned out everything else. My vision blurred, and the edges of my consciousness began to darken. I fought through the pain, through the cold, through the whispers. With a final desperate effort, I angled the last mirror to reflect the floodlight directly onto the Wraith. The creature let out a silent scream, its form shattering into fragments of shadow and light. The room fell silent, the oppressive darkness lifting as the Wraith was finally defeated. I collapsed to my knees, gasping for breath, the cold slowly receding from my body. The hospital was still. The only sound, the hum of the generator and the crackling of the lights. Back at my cabin, I began to relax from the hunt. I felt exhausted. I lit a fire in the hearth and settled into my chair, the warmth a stark contrast to the cold I'd felt in the hospital. As the flames crackled and danced, I felt a sense of satisfaction. The Wraith was defeated, but the shadows would always be there, lurking at the edges of the world. But I was ready to face them. For now, I could rest. The hunt was over, but the fight against the darkness would never end. And I was okay with that. It was who I was, who I had always been. A monster hunter. And I was damn good at it. With a final, contented sigh, I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes, the warmth of the fire and the satisfaction of a job well done lulling me into a peaceful sleep.